Daniel Mercer never planned to feed the gorilla more than once, but the gorilla kept coming back. Same time, same spot, same silence, and by the third morning Daniel stopped pretending it was a coincidence. This wasn't a hungry animal stumbling out of the forest. This was something else, something deliberate, and the moment Daniel recognized that, everything changed. Here's what most people get wrong about wild gorillas. They assume proximity means trust. It doesn't. A gorilla that tolerates your presence isn't comfortable, it's calculating. Every second it stays near you, it's running a decision. And this silverback, this 400-pound animal that could end a confrontation in under 3 seconds, was choosing every single morning to stay. Daniel needed to understand why. He was 61, retired wildlife surveyor, 30 years walking buffer zones and forest boundaries in southwestern Uganda, close enough to Bwindi that the park's edge was practically his backyard. He wasn't a tourist. He wasn't sentimental. He knew what gorilla behavior looked like when it was normal, and he knew with the certainty of long experience that this wasn't it. He started leaving fruit near the fig tree at the edge of his clearing. Then he went inside and didn't watch. They leave food and then press their face against the window, and the animal feels it, the attention, the wanting, and it stays away. Daniel went inside and waited. 10 minutes, 15, until he heard the soft compression of grass that meant the gorilla had crossed the clearing and taken what was left. He called him Kato, and every morning for 6 weeks Kato came back. But here's what Daniel noticed that nobody else would have caught. Kato wasn't watching him. He was watching the trees behind him. Every single visit, ears rotating, head turning, eyes cutting back toward the forest while he ate. Not the relaxed vigilance of an animal in familiar territory. Something tighter than that. Something that looked, if Daniel was being honest with himself, like fear. A 400-pound silverback, afraid of his own forest. Daniel filed that detail away and didn't know what to do with it yet. Then, around week 3, the behavior shifted. One morning Kato walked into the clearing, stood over the fruit and didn't eat. He looked at the food, then at the trees, then at Daniel's porch, then at the trees again. He was trying to show Daniel something. Daniel didn't follow. He wasn't reckless, but he picked up the phone and called Grace Alma, the wildlife officer who covered his region, and told her something was off. She said she'd monitor. She said to keep his distance. What nobody said, what nobody could have predicted, was what Kato would bring to Daniel's porch steps that same night. Daniel heard the branches first, close, closer than Kato had ever come after dark. He moved to the window slowly and looked out into the clearing and felt his breath stop. The silverback was standing at the base of his porch steps, 10 feet away, the closest he had ever been, and there was something draped across his hand. Daniel stood completely still. He watched Kato lower his hand toward the ground, watched the object fall onto the bottom step, watched the gorilla back away 4 paces, look up at the window, directly at Daniel, and then turn and walk into the dark. Daniel waited until morning to go outside. What he found on that step would send a wildlife team into the forest, lead them to something that made every officer go quiet, and force Daniel to completely reframe every morning he'd spent watching that gorilla eat fruit and stare at the trees. It wasn't food. It wasn't anything Daniel expected. It was a piece of rope, old, filthy, stiff with dried mud, and caught deep in the fibers near one end, dark, coarse fur, enough of it to mean something had been held by this rope against its will, something that hadn't gotten away clean. Grace Alma held the rope for 30 seconds and didn't say a word. Then she handed it to her colleague Martin, who ran snare detection across the buffer zone, and he turned it once in his hands and nodded. He said it was consistent with a wire-reinforced fiber snare, agricultural grade, cheap, functional, and completely illegal this close to protected land. The fur said an animal had been caught and had either pulled free or been cut loose. The quantity of fur said neither option had been painless. Daniel asked how old the snare site might be. Martin said recent, within weeks. Grace asked Daniel when Kato had started watching the trees instead of watching him. Daniel said week 3, maybe 4. Grace wrote something in her notebook and underlined it twice. They went into the forest that afternoon. Grace, Martin, Daniel, and a 4th officer holding the perimeter. They followed the gap between the strangler figs where Kato always entered the clearing, moving slow, staying on compressed game trails where the ground was already disturbed. 200 meters in, Martin crouched and pointed without touching anything. Pressed grass, a stake flush with the soil, the wire already gone, cut or pulled, but the compression pattern radiating outward from the anchor point was unmistakable. A snare site, recently disturbed. He flagged it orange and kept moving. Found 2 more within the next 100 meters, both disturbed, both stripped of their wire. Then Cato stepped out of the trees directly onto the trail ahead of them and stopped. Nobody moved. He wasn't displaying. No chest beating, no vocalization, no bluff charge. He just stood in the middle of the trail and looked at Daniel with the same expression he wore every morning at the fig tree. Steady, specific, waiting for Daniel to understand something he still hadn't figured out. Then Cato stepped off the trail to the right and disappeared into the brush. Grace looked at Daniel. Daniel said quietly that the gorilla had been trying to lead him somewhere for 2 days. They followed. 30 meters into the brush, Daniel heard it. Small, exhausted, the kind of sound an animal makes when it has been making sounds for a very long time and is almost out of strength to continue. A broken, breathless cry from somewhere beyond a fallen log half buried in ferns. Martin's fist went up. Everyone stopped. The sound came again. Daniel looked up and found Cato standing 20 feet away, completely still, watching them. Then the silverback did something that stopped Daniel cold. He sat down, right there in the undergrowth. In the middle of everything he sat, like an animal that had been carrying something alone for too long and had finally found someone to hand it to. Whatever was behind that log, Cato had known it was there the whole time. The rope on the porch steps wasn't random. It wasn't debris. It was a distress call from an animal with no other way to make one. Behind the fallen log was a juvenile gorilla, 3 years old, maybe less, lying on its side with one leg extended at an angle that made every person who saw it go quiet. A snare wire was twisted tight above the ankle, cutting deep. It was alive, eyes open, tracking movement, but it had stopped struggling. Animals stop struggling when they have nothing left. Martin called for backup. Dr. Osei, the field veterinarian, arrived 20 minutes later and made the call fast. No sedation. The juvenile was too weak. They had one clean attempt to remove the wire without sending the animal into shock, and they had to do it with a 400-pound silverback 15 feet away in the brush. Cato wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing, shifting his weight, his breathing audible. When the juvenile cried out as Dr. Osei made first contact with the wire, Cato came forward 3 steps and stopped. His shoulders were up. His eyes were fixed. Every person in that clearing made themselves very still. Daniel spoke. Not words, just sound. Low, steady. The same tone he'd used every morning for 6 weeks on his porch. The sound that had become, without either of them planning it, a signal that said, "Nothing bad is happening here." Cato stopped moving. He looked at Daniel once, then back at the juvenile. He stayed where he was. The wire came free in under 4 minutes. The juvenile flinched hard, then went quiet. Damaged tissue, but the bone had held. It would carry a scar. It would walk. When the team lifted the stretcher and moved toward the tree line, Cato rose to his full height. Every person felt it without looking directly at him. Daniel said his name once. The silverback held still long enough for the team to clear the forest. Then he was gone. No sound, no display, just absence, the way the forest takes things back when it's ready. Daniel stood at the tree line and stared at the empty trail for a long moment. 6 weeks, the patience, the watching. The morning Cato stood over the fruit and couldn't eat because he had somewhere else he needed Daniel to look. He hadn't been coming for food. He'd been coming because Daniel's clearing was the one place in his territory where humans didn't set traps. And that's what made what happened 2 days later so devastating. Cato came back on the second morning, before sunrise, and he didn't come alone. Daniel saw the shapes first, dark forms in the mist at the tree line. Then his eyes adjusted and he stopped counting at 5 because more kept materializing out of the gray. Females, younger males, and near the back of the group, moving slowly but moving, a juvenile with a slight hitch in its stride. Daniel set his coffee down on the porch railing. His hands weren't steady. Grace had called the previous evening with the full sweep results. In 48 hours, the wildlife team had found 11 additional snare sites in the buffer zone corridor. 4 were active, All four were positioned deliberately along the primary feeding and movement routes of Cato's group. Whoever set them knew exactly where this family traveled. The group had been living inside a killing corridor for weeks. The juvenile behind the log was the one who hadn't made it through in time. Daniel listened to all of it and said very little. What he kept thinking about was the rope, that single piece of frayed fur-caught rope carried out of a trap-laced forest and placed carefully on a porch step in the dark by an animal with no language, no framework, no way to ask for help, except showing up every morning for 6 weeks to a human who hadn't hurt him yet, and eventually trusting that human with the one piece of evidence he could carry. Most animals in that situation die alone. Cato had done something else. Now he walked forward from the tree line and stopped at the base of the fig tree. The group held at the forest edge. He looked at Daniel on the porch. Then he looked down. He reached toward the ground slowly and placed something next to the empty fruit bowl. Stepped back. Waited. Daniel crossed the clearing and crouched down. It was a piece of wild fruit, half-eaten, the kind that grew deep in the forest. Nothing Daniel had ever put out, nothing from his kitchen. Small, bruised, worth nothing. He stared at it. Then he sat down in the wet grass of the clearing, right there, and put his face in both hands. It wasn't the fruit, it was what the fruit meant. For months Daniel had been the one leaving something at the base of that tree. Every morning, a gesture that said, "I see you, I mean no harm, you can come back tomorrow." And now for the first time, Cato had left something for him, not because gorillas understand reciprocity the way humans do, not because he was saying thank you in any conscious sense, but because after everything, the rope, the forest, the rescue, the snares, the wire around his family's ankle, this animal had decided completely on his own terms that Daniel was part of something he wanted to return to. That was the gift. Not the fruit, the return. When Daniel looked up, the group was gone. The clearing was quiet and golden with early light. The fig tree stood at the edge of it, the way it always had, ordinary, unchanged, unbothered by any of this. He stopped the daily feedings gradually after that. The snares were cleared. The corridor was being monitored. The forest was safer. The routine had done what it needed to do. Cato still came sometimes, irregular now, unhurried, the way a wild animal moves through land it no longer fears. Daniel would see him at the tree line in the early morning, just sitting, just present, and then he'd be gone. The distance between them never closed. It didn't need to. Some things are built entirely in the space between two living creatures who have decided, without words and without certainty, that the other one can be trusted. That space was enough. That space for both of them was everything.